Miwa, the operations officer, interrupted, "But hasn't the second attack wave already been launched for another strike at Midway?" This remark jolted everyone to the sudden realization that only a moment before they had been expecting the Nagumo force to launch the second wave against Midway to complete the destruction of the enemy's shore-based air forces. Sasaki was covered with confusion. He immediately phoned the radio room and asked if there had been any report that the second attack wave had taken off for Midway. "No, sir. There is no indication that it has." The reply brought a deep sigh of relief. The enemy carriers, it was thought, would quickly be disposed of by planes of our second attack wave. This optimism was amazing in view of the fact that not only in the planning of the operation, but even up to just a few moments before, no one had even dreamed that enemy carriers might be encountered on the approach to Midway. Now, with this calculation suddenly proven wrong, there was momentary surprise, but nobody seemed greatly concerned about it or about the fact that Combined Fleet Headquarters had been guilty of a serious oversight. Everyone appeared fully convinced that the Japanese forces would be able to smash the enemy, however prepared he might be, as soon as his fleet was located. The situation reminds one of a Japanese wrestling champion who, confident in his own strength, stands majestically in the middle of the ring, allowing his opponent to act first. At 0847, still another message from Tone's scout plane reported the sighting of 2 additional enemy cruisers 250 miles northeast of Midway. The pilot obviously was doing a good job of maintaining contact, but he radioed shortly afterwards that he was running low on fuel and would have to return. This caused momentary concern on board Yamato, as contact might be lost, but a message sent by Rear Admiral Abe, Commander Cruiser Division 8, was soon picked up, ordering the plane to continue its contact until relieved. Abe's alert move drew praise from Chief of Staff Ugaki, who voiced the opinion that the Nagumo force was fully equal to the task at hand. These pleasant speculations were abruptly halted, however, by a scout plane report at 0900 that 10 carrier-borne enemy planes were heading for the Nagumo force. This was the last information received concerning that force for almost 2 hours. Yet, despite the temporary blackout, Yamamoto and his staff did not feel the least bit uneasy about the impending action. Then the blow fell. At 10:50, the chief signal officer, Commander Yoshiro Wada, painfully and without words, handed Admiral Yamamoto a radio message from Rear Admiral Abe in tone. It said, "Fires raging on board Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi resulting from attacks by enemy carrier and land-based planes. We plan to have Hiryu engage enemy carriers. We are temporarily withdrawing to the north to assemble our forces." Instead of the expected easy victory, the picture had suddenly become one of catastrophic defeat. Of Nagumo's 4 carriers, 3, including the flagship, were obviously out of action, and only Hiryu was left to carry on the fight. The enormity of the disaster was such that Admiral Yamamoto and his staff could scarcely believe it. Too stunned to speak, the commander-in-chief just groaned as he read the tragic words of Abe's message. The jubilant optimism of the staff changed instantaneously to black despair. There was only one course that offered any hope of staving off the immediate collapse of the entire operation. This was to concentrate all forces at the scene of battle and overwhelm the enemy by sheer weight of numbers. Admiral Yamamoto decided to rush immediately with his own battleships to the support of the crippled carrier striking force and personally to direct subsequent battle operations. Nagato and other ships engaged in refueling were again scarcely visible from the flagship, as the fog had once more begun to settle. Although speed was vital, it was fully an hour before the force was finally able to assemble and get underway. Course was set at 120 degrees, and fuel was poured on until all ships were making 20 knots. This speed was maintained through the thickening fog, which soon rendered each ship invisible to every other. Such hazardous manoeuvres were quite beyond the imagination of peacetime navigators, and indeed beyond all common sense. But this was battle, and battles, like the wars which occasion them, are often fought beyond the compass of common sense. At 12:20, Admiral Yamamoto dispatched the following order to his forces. All forces will operate as follows and attack the enemy in the Midway area. 1. Noon position of main body, 35 degrees 08, N, 171 degrees 05, W, course 120 degrees, speed 20 knots. 2. The Midway invasion force, Kondo, will detach part of its strength to cover the transport group and will direct it to retire temporarily to the northwest. 3. The 2nd Carrier Striking Force, Kakuta, will join the 1st Carrier Striking Force, Nagumo, as soon as possible. 4. Submarine Squadrons 3 and 5 will redeploy on Cordon Line C. Editor's note: a line along 168 degrees W longitude from 26 degrees to 36 degrees N latitude. It was evident from this order that Yamamoto and his staff had not abandoned their hope of destroying the American surface force and capturing Midway. An additional directive sent out shortly thereafter fixed a standby position for the transport group at a point 500 miles west of Midway, so that it would be sufficiently close if called upon to occupy the island. Yamamoto and his staff were now vitally concerned with the question of how much air strength the enemy still had at Midway, as this was a key consideration in laying plans for the impending operations. Although 3 Japanese carriers had been put out of action, Hiryu was still intact and could be used for striking the enemy carriers. Also, a night surface action and other offensive measures could be resorted to. But against enemy shore-based air, our only weapon had been the carrier striking force, and the results of its first Midway attack were not clear. Rear Admiral Ugaki therefore addressed a message to Admiral Nagumo on board his new flagship Nagara, asking for a detailed report on the first raid results. When this inquiry brought no answer, Yamamoto concluded that Tomonaga's attack could not have been very successful. This conclusion, which was supported by the fact that Tomonaga himself had recommended a second attack, gave rise to the fear that unless the Midway Air Base was destroyed without delay, the Americans might move in more planes from Hawaii, making the island even more difficult to capture. Captain Kuroshima therefore urged the dispatch of a surface force to bombard the island during the night. Admiral Yamamoto promptly accepted the proposal and decided to assign the mission to Vice Admiral Kondo, whose invasion force main body was nearest to the target and included high-speed warships. It was also decided to defer the scheduled landing operations on Midway and the Aleutians until after the enemy carrier force had been destroyed. In accordance with these decisions, Admiral Yamamoto issued the following order at 13:10. 1. Attack Method C will be employed against the enemy fleet. 2. Commander Midway Invasion Force will dispatch part of its strength to bombard and destroy air bases on Midway. 3. Landing operations on Midway and the Aleutians are temporarily postponed. Attack Method C called for the concentration of all combat forces from both the Midway and the Aleutians areas to engage the enemy fleet in decisive battle. A little more than an hour before this order was issued, Admiral Yamamoto had received Admiral Nagumo's 1150 message, the first since Nagumo's transfer to Nagara, reporting the extent of damage to his carriers, and also announcing his intention to attack the enemy with his remaining strength and then retire to the north. Shortly after 14:30, Yamato picked up a further message sent out by Nagumo, this time addressed to Rear Admiral Kakuta's 2nd Carrier Striking Force cruising south of the Aleutians. It said, 1. Position of 1st Carrier Striking Force at 1400 June 4th 30 degrees 48 N 178 degrees 31 W. We are planning to head north after destroying enemy task force to the east. 2. 2nd Carrier Striking Force will rendezvous with us immediately. Obviously, a great deal depended on how soon Admiral Kakuta, with his 2 carriers, Ryuho and Junyo, could come south to bolster the Nagumo force. Kakuta's reply, received at 15:30, was not encouraging. Will rapidly proceed south after recovering planes from the Dutch harbour attack. It will refuel at LUT 44 degrees 40 N long, 176 degrees 20 W during the morning of the 6th, and thereafter will operate so as to join the 1st Task Force. Position as of 1500 June 4th is 120 miles southwest of Dutch Harbour. This report made it clear that the Kakuta force had been able to execute its planned strike on Dutch harbour despite the dense fog. However, it was equally apparent that the force could not be expected to join the battle in the Midway area before the afternoon of the 8th. Meanwhile, reconnaissance reports were so contradictory that Combined Fleet had no accurate information on the strength of the enemy carrier force until 1615, when Admiral Yamaguchi radioed, "From our returning pilots' reports, the enemy force is apparently composed of 3 carriers, 5 large cruisers, and 15 destroyers. Our attacks succeeded in damaging 2 carriers." This was formidable opposition by any standard, but it was a bright note in the otherwise gloomy picture to learn that Yamaguchi's flyers had succeeded at least in damaging 2 of the enemy's carriers. At 1736, a Chikuma search plane radioed that it had spotted the enemy force a mere 100 miles or so to the east of Nagumo's battleships and cruisers, and that the enemy ships were withdrawing eastward. As sunset this day would be at 1832, there was still hope that the Kondo force might engage the enemy in a night action to turn the tide of battle in our favour. In its training program, the Japanese Navy had always emphasized night battle, and these tactics were particularly favoured by our commanders. It now seemed the only chance for our salvation. Disposition of forces, 1915 on the 4th of June 1942, west longitude date, zone +12 time. But Japanese misfortunes were not yet at an end. A further stupefying message came from Admiral Nagumo at 1755. "Hiryu hit by bombs and set afire, 1730. With this crippling of Nagumo's last remaining carrier, our offensive spearhead was completely smashed. In the light of the whole situation, an order sent by Admiral Yamamoto to his entire command at 1915, an hour and 20 minutes after the news of Hiryu's loss, was so strangely optimistic as to suggest that Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet was deliberately trying to prevent the morale of our forces from collapsing. It said, "The enemy fleet has been practically destroyed and is retiring eastward. Combined Fleet units in the vicinity are preparing to pursue the remnants of the enemy force and at the same time to occupy Midway. The main body will reach 32 degrees 08 N, 175 degrees 45 E at 0300 on the 5th. Course 090 degree, speed 20 knots. The carrier striking force, invasion force, less cruiser division 7, and submarine force will immediately contact and attack the enemy." Jangled nerves and bloodshot eyes on board Yamato testified to the prevailing anxiety. Every man was eager for a night action in which our losses might be avenged. The futility of such hopes was manifest, however, when Nagumo reported at 21:30, "Total enemy strength is 5 carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, and 15 destroyers. They are steaming westward. We are retiring to the northwest, escorting Hiryu. Speed 18 knots. Ugaki voiced the dejection of the entire Combined Fleet staff when he remarked gloomily, "The Nagumo force has no stomach for a night engagement." But Admiral Yamamoto was still determined to attempt the night attack. Realizing the need for unified command, he ordered Admiral Kondo to take charge of the attack force. Yamato soon picked up an order which Kondo dispatched at 23:40 to his night action force. The invasion force, main body, Kondo force, will reach position 30 degrees 28 N, 178 degrees 35 W, 0300 June 5th. Thereafter, searches will be made to the east in an effort to engage the enemy at night. The first carrier striking force, less Hiryu, Akagi, and their escorts, will reverse course immediately and participate in the night engagement. From this order itself, it was all too evident that there was little hope of contacting the enemy fleet before dawn, and this was our only chance. So the last flame of hope among the anxious men on board the flagship slowly flickered out. Back in Tokyo, the Naval General Staff had been following the progress of the battle with steadily mounting apprehension. When the report came in that Hiryu had suffered the same fate as Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, they felt that the operation was doomed. Our 4 finest fleet carriers were lost. Enemy air strength on Midway was not destroyed. the enemy still had at least one and probably two undamaged carriers. Under these circumstances, the Tokyo strategists concluded that it was folly to pursue the operation further. Admiral Nagano and his subordinates were concerned over more than the postponed invasions of Midway and the Aleutians, or even the loss of the four carriers. The Japanese Navy still had more warships of every category than the United States Navy had in the Pacific. What troubled these planners most was the fear that Admiral Yamamoto, in a desperate effort to recoup Nagumo's defeat, might take some long gamble and sacrifice his entire force to the overwhelming enemy air strength in the Midway area. Yet the Naval General Staff did not intervene. Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, chief of the Operations Section, later recalled that although the atmosphere was charged with anxious tension, the whole development of the battle was watched in silence. There were no instructions, no orders, no advice issued from Tokyo. Command of the operation was left completely to the discretion of Admiral Yamamoto. Once the idea of a night engagement had been abandoned, the combined fleet staff in Yamato turned to pondering the next move. Everyone inwardly recognized that we were defeated, yet not a single member of the staff proposed suspension of the operation. Instead, they desperately cast about for a way to salvage something from the defeat. They were like drowning men grabbing at straws. Various temporizing measures were proposed. An air staff officer advocated a further air attack on the enemy fleet, employing a makeshift force consisting of the small number of planes available in light carriers, Hosho, Yamamoto force, and Zuiho, Kondo force, supplemented by the float planes of the battleships and cruisers. Such an attack, he argued, might at least inflict some damage on the enemy carriers and reduce their offensive power, thus affording a better chance for the Japanese battleship and cruiser forces to swing the tide of battle. The gunnery officer favoured stronger action along the line of the already planned night bombardment of Midway Air Base by heavy cruisers of the Kondo force. He expressed the opinion that if a sufficient number of heavily gunned ships were employed, the bombardment might succeed in inflicting enough damage to keep the enemy's Midway-based air forces neutralized for at least a day. Another staff officer voiced the optimistic belief that the anti-aircraft firepower of the battleships would be adequate to repulse any air attacks that might be launched against the Yamamoto force by the enemy carriers. The tentative plan drawn up by Captain Kuroshima as a result of these staff discussions was little short of fantastic. It called for all the battleships, including Yamato, to close Midway in broad daylight of the following day, the 5th of June, and shell the airbase installations with their main batteries. When this proposal was laid before Rear Admiral Ugaki, he at least recognized it for what it was, a face-saving plan of suicidal recklessness and folly. He rejected it without mincing words. The stupidity of engaging such shore installations with a surface force ought to be clear to you. The airfield on Midway is still usable, a large number of American planes is based there, and some of the enemy carriers are still intact. Our battleships, for all their firepower, would be destroyed by enemy air and submarine attacks before we could even get close enough to use our big guns. If circumstances permit, we will be able to launch another offensive after the second carrier striking force, Kakuta, has joined. But even if that proves impossible, and we must accept defeat in this operation, we will not have lost the war. There will still be 8 carriers in the fleet, counting those which are to be completed soon. So we should not lose heart. In battle, as in chess, it is the fool who lets himself be led into a reckless move through desperation. Ugaki's level-headed intervention thus scotched the plan, but not all members of the staff were satisfied. To some, the thought of having to shoulder responsibility for defeat was unbearable, and they were ready to gamble everything for a chance to save face. Their attitude was plainly expressed by one of the officers who protested to Ugaki, "But how can we apologize to His Majesty for this defeat?" Admiral Yamamoto, who had remained silent during the discussions, spoke up now. "Leave that to me," he said abruptly. "I am the only one who must apologize to His Majesty." It was evident from his brief remark that Admiral Yamamoto himself had all but decided to abandon any further attempts to engage the enemy fleet or to capture Midway. At 0015 on the 5th of June, He took the first step towards such abandonment by ordering Vice Admiral Kondo and Vice Admiral Nagumo, whose forces were still manoeuvring for a night attack on the enemy carriers and a bombardment of Midway, to suspend these operations and join the main body. The order read, 1. The Midway Invasion Force, less the transport group presently standing by, but including Cruiser Division 7, and 1st Carrier Striking Force, less Akagi, Hiryu and their escorts, will join the main body. 2. At 0900 today, the main body will be in position 32 degrees 08 and N, 179 degrees 01 EE, course 090 degree, speed 20 knots. Admiral Yamamoto now faced another painful decision regarding the scuttling of Akagi. Earlier, when Akagi's skipper had requested permission to sink her, Yamamoto had ordered that this action be delayed because his own and Kondo's forces were advancing to engage the enemy. Now, however, hope of an engagement was virtually gone, and Kondo and Nagumo had been ordered to pull back toward the main body. The decision could therefore be delayed no longer. Yet the fact that the Japanese Navy had never before scuttled one of its own warships made the decision an exceedingly hard one to take. Admiral Yamamoto finally accepted this grave responsibility and ordered the destruction of Akagi at 0250. Only 5 minutes after this order went out from Yamato, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, at 0255 on June 5th, issued a further order which set the seal on the defeat of the Japanese forces. It read, 1. The Midway operation is cancelled. 2. The main body will assemble the Midway Invasion Force and the 1st Carrier Striking Force, less Hiryu and her escorts, and the combined forces will carry out refueling during the morning of the 6th of June at position 33 degrees N, 170 degrees E. 3. The screening force, Hiryu and her escorts, and Nishin will proceed to the above position. 4. The transport group will proceed westward out of range of Midway-based planes. Thus, the Midway operation was finally abandoned. But there still remained the difficult and hazardous task of rounding up the scattered Japanese forces and effecting their retirement from the battle area under the ever-present threat of enemy attack. The enemy had tasted blood and would thirst for more. Meanwhile, in the Aleutians, Rear Admiral Kakuta's carriers had delivered another air attack on Dutch harbour during the 4th of June, in spite of adverse weather. The attack was carried out by a picked force of 9 fighters, 11 dive bombers, and 6 level bombers. Availing themselves of narrow cloud gaps, these planes destroyed fuel storage tanks, hangars, large merchant vessels, and other targets with notable success. On the return flight, Junyo's planes encountered some American P-40 fighters over Otter Point at the northeast end of Umnak Island. A dogfight ensued, in which 4 enemy planes were reported shot down. During the action, the Japanese pilots noticed an airfield directly below them, the only one discovered by our planes during the whole Aleutians operation. Our attack force lost 1 fighter and 2 bombers in aerial combat, and 2 other bombers, badly damaged, failed to get back to the carriers. This ended the air offensive of the 2nd Carrier Striking Force against enemy territory in the Aleutians. Almost simultaneously with the issuance of Admiral Yamamoto's order calling off the Midway operation, misfortune overtook the Japanese forces again. But this time the enemy was only indirectly responsible. When Combined Fleet, at 13:10 on the 4th of June, had ordered Vice Admiral Kondo to carry out a night bombardment of Midway with part of his force, he had assigned this mission to Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita's support force made up of Cruiser Division 7's 4 heavy cruisers, Kumano, Suzuya, Mikuma, and Mogami, and 2 destroyers of Destroyer Division 8. The cruisers carried 10 8-inch guns and were the fastest ships in the Japanese Navy. Admiral Kondo had also considered including fast battleships Kongo and Hiei in the attack unit, because their 14-inch guns would markedly heighten the effectiveness of the bombardment. However, the battleships were in his own invasion force main body, which was more distant from the target, and they consequently could not reach Midway before sunrise on the 5th. Admiral Kurita received Kondo's order, assigning his force the bombardment mission at about 1500 on the 4th. He immediately increased speed for the run-in, but as he was 400 miles west of Midway, his chances of reaching the target before dawn the next day were extremely slim, even if his cruisers ran at their best speed of about 32 knots. Even if he did make it, his withdrawal would undoubtedly have to be made in daylight under the menace of enemy air attack. He therefore informed Admiral Kondo that he desired the cooperation of other forces to ensure the success of the attack. Kondo, whose own force included light carrier Zuiho with a small complement of fighter planes, forwarded this recommendation to Admiral Yamamoto, but the latter decided that it could not be accepted. Kurita would have to go it alone. With heroic determination, Kurita's ships raced eastward at top speed. Unable to keep pace with the cruisers, the destroyers soon fell behind, and by 2300 were out of sight. On board the cruisers, preparations were actually made to send a suicide demolition party ashore as a last resort if the bombardment failed. Meanwhile, on board Yamato, the combined fleet staff rechecked Kurita's position, as last reported, and found that he was farther away from Midway than they had figured. Their calculations showed that the projected bombardment could not possibly be made on schedule. Consequently, at 20 minutes past midnight, an order was sent to the Kurita force cancelling its mission. By the time he received the order, Kurita had already closed to within 90 miles of Midway. In compliance with the combined fleet directive, Kurita turned his speeding cruisers about and set a northwest course. Shortly thereafter, flagship Kumano, leading the division, sighted a surfaced enemy submarine 4 degrees off the starboard bow. Kurita instantly ordered his ships to execute an emergency 45-degree turn to port. The signal, red, red, was flashed to Suzuya, next astern of the flagship, by a low-powered directional signal lamp, and Kumano then swung to port. Suzuya, in turn, also relayed the signal and turned left, as did Mikuma, the third ship. It was about 2 hours before sunrise. Clouds hung low, veiling everything in darkness. Tension had relaxed in the cruisers when the force turned away from Midway, and perhaps the letdown gave rise to lack of vigilance. Whatever the reason, Mogami, the last ship in line, failed to get the emergency turn signal in time, with the result that she ploughed into Mikuma's port quarter. All of the cruisers had reduced their speed somewhat since the turnabout, but they were still making 28 knots. As a result of the collision, Mogami lost her bow section forward of the first turret and was forced to halt. Mikuma suffered only slight hull damage, which did not affect her combat efficiency or maneuverability. Notified of the accident, Admiral Kurita immediately turned back to stand by the cripple. Mogami's skipper, Captain Akira Soji, soon reported that he could make 12 knots, so the Admiral ordered Captain Sakiyama, in Mikuma, and 2 ships of Destroyer Division 8, Arashio and Asashio, to escort her. Kurita, with Kumano and Suzuya, then headed for the designated rendezvous with Admiral Yamamoto's main body. By this time dawn was breaking, and Mogami and her escorts limped westward at 12 knots, every man in the 4 ships apprehensively expecting momentary attack by enemy planes, and perhaps pursuit by the enemy fleet. Despite the important role which Combined Fleet's Midway plan had assigned to the submarine forces, only 1 submarine actually made any noteworthy contribution to the operation. This was I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe. After reconnoitering Midway on the 1st of June, as mentioned in an earlier chapter, I-168 maintained a stealthy vigil around the island, and was still there on the 4th when the battle began. Tanabe could not follow the development of the battle in detail, but radio messages picked up by the submarine told enough for him to know that it was going against the Japanese forces. Shortly after 20:30 on the 4th of June, he received an order from Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet in Yamato, directing him to shell and destroy the enemy airbase on Eastern Island. The order instructed Tanabe to keep up his bombardment until 0200 on the 5th, after which time Rear Admiral Kurita's heavy cruisers were scheduled to take over and complete the destruction of the airbase. Tanabe promptly moved his submarine into position, brought her to the surface, and opened fire at 0130. The shelling did little if any physical damage. although it may have had some psychological effect in making the defenders think that there was still danger of an invasion. Searchlights from the island began probing the darkness in the direction of I-168, and presently shore batteries opened fire. It was too unhealthy for the submarine to remain, so she promptly dove and withdrew. After dawn, enemy patrol planes spotted her and made a heavy depth charge attack, but I-168 escaped unscathed and went looking for bigger game. Tanabe had received an early morning report that an enemy carrier was damaged and adrift in the waters north of Midway, not more than 150 miles from I-168. Once freed of pursuers, he headed for this fetching target, making a careful approach through the heavy enemy patrol cordon around Midway. His caution was finally rewarded on the 6th, when he looked through his periscope at 1331 to see 7 U.S. destroyers swarming around crippled Yorktown in position 30 degrees 35 N, 177 degrees 20 W. He closed to within 1,900 yards before firing 4 torpedoes, which were certain to get hits at that distance. As soon as the torpedoes were away, I-168 dove for the safety of the depths. Shocks from the explosions were felt within 5 minutes, followed shortly by the first of many depth charges bursting close by, each one shaking the submarine like a leaf. 60 near misses were counted before the violent shocks finally caused damage, which forced I-168 to surface. The hunters closed in immediately, forcing the submarine to submerge again in spite of her injuries. It seemed that the destroyers would never give up the chase, and finally Tanabe was forced to surface once more. What could be more miserable than a submarine in this predicament? Fortunately, however, the enemy destroyers had at last abandoned pursuit just a short while before, and I-168 thus escaped what would otherwise have been certain destruction. As a result of Captain Tanabe's bold venture, the American carrier Yorktown was left staggering under the effects of 2 direct torpedo hits, and destroyer Hammond, which had been alongside the carrier, was blasted in two by a torpedo and sank almost instantly. Although abandonment of the Midway operation had been finally ordered at 0255 on the 5th of June, Admiral Yamamoto kept his battleships headed eastward through the remaining hours of darkness in order to join with the Nagumo and Kondo forces withdrawing from the battle area. Grim determination permeated the flagship as everyone realized that this maneuver would bring the Yamamoto force too within range of enemy attack, thus creating the danger of further losses and casualties to the Japanese forces. The sun rose at 0440 in a clear and cloudless sky, affording visibility in excess of 40 miles. It was the finest weather since the fleet had left the homeland 10 days earlier. This day would see the battleships of Combined Fleet, excluding the 4 old ones in Vice Admiral Takasu's guard force, make their closest approach to the enemy since the war's start. Every ship maintained a strict alert against air raids. Admiral Yamamoto's ships sighted and joined Kondo's invasion force main body shortly after sunrise. By 0700 they had closed, and from their position, 320 miles northwest of Midway, set course to the northwest. Meanwhile, Nagumo's scattered ships continued retreating northwesterly, as they had since early morning, to join the main body. According to calculations and plans, Nagumo should also have joined at this time and position. When he failed to appear, a search plane was launched from Hosho to find him. It did, some 40 miles to the northeast, and by 11:55 most of his ships had caught up with and joined the others. What was left bore little resemblance to the mighty force which had sailed from the homeland. Not one carrier remained, and only half the original number of destroyers was present, 6 having been assigned to stand by the stricken carriers. It was a sight that brought home to those on board the flagship the full tragedy of the defeat. About this time, a Hosho search plane reported sighting the smashed and drifting hulk of Hiryu, still afloat despite the coup de grace administered by her destroyer escorts many hours earlier. Admiral Nagumo immediately dispatched destroyer Tanikaze to rescue survivors reported on the derelict and ordered a seaplane launched from Nagara to aid in the search. Nagara's plane arrived at the reported spot but found no trace of Hiryu, and Tanikaze also searched the area in vain. While the destroyer was conducting its search, enemy carrier planes subjected her to a fierce bombing attack. The first wave of 4 dive bombers struck at 16:36, the second wave of 26 an hour and a half later, and a third wave of 6 more at 18:45. But luck was with the destroyer, and she suffered only slight damage from a near miss, which did not affect her battle efficiency. She succeeded in shooting down 1 enemy plane. Thanks to Tanikaze's absorption of these attacks, the big concentration of Japanese ships close by escaped the notice of enemy planes, and the transfer of survivors of the 4 sunken carriers from the rescuing destroyers was carried out in the afternoon without interference. Immediately on joining, the loaded destroyers began shifting their passengers to battleships Mutsu, Nagato, Haruna, and Kirishima. Even without an enemy attack, the transfers were difficult enough. The sea was rough, and the long swells made it impossible to bring the destroyers alongside the battleships. The fleet finally hove to, and boats had to be lowered to shuttle the survivors. The most seriously wounded had to be carried by stretcher. Darkness came, and the work continued into the pitch-dark night. Not a single star glimmered through the low-hanging clouds. All crews kept frantically at the arduous task until it was finally completed. The sick bays and living quarters of the battleships were jammed with wounded, mostly victims of burns. Some distance to the south, limping Mogami and her 3 companions were the target of air attacks by 12 American B-17S and as many Marine Corps dive bombers during the day. The former had little success, scoring only a near miss on Mogami, killing 2 men. The pilot of the leading dive bomber, however, after being hit by anti-aircraft fire, attempted a daring suicide crash into Mikuma's bridge. Editor's note: this brave sacrifice hit was made by Captain R.E. Fleming, USMC. The Japanese account given here indicates that his action caused much greater damage to Mikuma than hitherto believed. He missed the bridge but crashed into the after turret, spreading fire over the air intake of the starboard engine room. This caused an explosion of gas fumes below, killing all hands working in the engine room. This was a damaging blow to the cruiser, hitherto unscathed except for the slight hull damage received in the collision with Mogami. Both cruisers were now hurt, and they continued their westward withdrawal with darkening prospects of escaping the enemy's fury. At 12:59 June 6th, Vice Admiral Kakuta's second carrier striking force was ordered to rejoin Admiral Hosogaya's northern force to permit execution of the suspended Aleutians landing operations a day later than originally scheduled. To assist in this project, Admiral Yamamoto issued a further order at 23:20 designating additional units to be released shortly to Hosogaya's command. These were battleships Kongo and Hiei, cruisers Tone and Chikuma, light carrier Zuiho, seaplane tender Kamikawa Maru, and 14 submarines from Submarine Squadron 2 and Submarine Division 13. The dispatch of these reinforcements was aimed primarily at discouraging a possible enemy attempt to recapture the islands of Kiska and Attu, but hope was also entertained that the northern operations might give rise to an opportunity for destroying the enemy fleet. After the transfer of survivors to the battleships of the main body was completed, the combined forces got underway again and headed for the scheduled refueling rendezvous at 33 degrees 00 N, 170 degrees 00 E. By dawn of the next day, all ships except Mogami, Mikuma, and their 2 destroyer escorts would be beyond the attack range of Midway-based planes, though not of planes from the enemy carriers, if the latter chose to pursue. A striking aspect of this great assemblage of warships was that it contained no fleet carriers. Light carriers Zuiho and Hosho had the distinction of being the only flat-tops present, and their decks were intermittently aflurry with the activity of launching and recovering planes for anti-submarine patrol. What were the feelings of the men in the ships as their westward withdrawal continued? Were there any who found solace for the loss of our 4 great carriers in the fact that the battleship main strength remained intact? There could hardly have been many now who did not realize with bitter regret that big guns alone were powerless to win a battle. With our carriers had gone the backbone of our offensive power. Virtually every man in the fleet was weighed down by the sad realization that the Imperial Navy had just suffered a crushing defeat. By the morning of the 6th of June, Japan, 7 June, the day Midway was to have been invaded, flagship Yamato was over 600 miles from Midway and headed for Japan. The weather had again turned foul, visibility was poor, and another siege of heavy fog was threatening. The main portion of the fleet was now out of range of American land-based planes, but still there was cause for anxiety because the whereabouts of the enemy task force was not known. Some consolation was taken from the thought that if American carriers were in pursuit, the foul weather would provide a welcome cloak of concealment from air attack. On Yamato's port quarter followed Nagara, from whose truck Admiral Nagumo's flag seemed to flutter in shame. It must have been humiliating for this commander, who for 6 months had feared no enemy, to be retreating from such a bitter defeat. On the bridge of Yamato, her captain's nervous commands betrayed his concern over pursuit by enemy planes and submarines. Light carrier Hosho, to the rear of the battleship group, intermittently launched and recovered anti-submarine planes. In the operations room below Yamato's bridge, a growing uneasiness prevailed among the staff officers. Throughout the night, they had been gathered around the large table awaiting developments and absorbed in troubled thoughts. There was an apprehensive feeling that the battle was not yet over. Most immediate concern was for the safety of the damaged cruisers, Mikuma and Mogami, and their standby destroyers, Arashio and Asashio. These fears materialized at 6:30 when word came from Captain Shakao Sakiyama of Mikuma. 2 enemy carrier planes sighted. Successive reports from the beleaguered ships told the story of events all too clearly. Attacked by 6 dive bombers which scored 1 hit, enemy carriers seemed to be pursuing. 6:45. Bombed by many carrier-based planes. 1 enemy seaplane sighted. 3 enemy seaplanes are shadowing us. Enemy surface force appears to have joined in the pursuit. 7:45. Mogami received 1 hit causing minor damage. 3 planes shot down. 8 o'clock. We are being pursued by enemy carriers and other ships operating in this area. We are heading for Wake Island. We are in position bearing 030 degree, distant 710 miles from Wake Island. The damaged cruisers had reached a point 500 miles west of Midway when the first wave of enemy carrier planes struck. Mikuma was hit once and Mogami twice in this attack, but the bombs inflicted only minor damage. Successive attacks, however, brought more hits and increased damage. 5 bomb hits on Mikuma at 10:30 spread fires throughout the ship, forcing her to a stop. The fires rapidly increased in fury until 10:58, when they set off a tremendous internal explosion, which eliminated all hope of saving the ship. Efforts to transfer her crew to a destroyer were underway when another attack of 10 planes came at 12 o'clock, scoring more hits and sending the cruiser to the depths. Captain Sakiyama was wounded in the 3rd attack of the day, but he continued in command until Mikuma went down. He was thrown clear of the sinking ship and picked up by a destroyer. However, death overtook this valiant officer on the 13th of June in the sickbay of cruiser Suzuya. In the course of the day's raids, Mogami suffered a total of 6 bomb hits. 9 officers and 81 men were killed, but quick and effective damage control saved the ship from sinking, and she succeeded in shooting down 8 planes. Her skipper, Captain Soji, assumed command of the 3 remaining ships, and after picking up Mikuma's survivors, resumed the westward withdrawal. The accompanying destroyers had managed to shoot down 2 attacking planes during this action, but each was hit by a bomb. On board Arashio, 37 men were killed, and Commander Ogawa, Commander Destroyer Division 8, was seriously injured, while 22 men were killed in Asashio. Neither ship, however, was damaged enough to impair navigation, and both did their utmost to fulfill their screening duties. Aside from the carriers lost in the preceding 2 days, Mikuma was the largest Japanese warship to be sunk since the start of the war. The constant companion of her sister ship, Mogami, they had fought together in the Battle off Batavia on the 1st of March, sinking USS Houston and the Australian cruiser Perth. They had seen action in the invasions of the Andamans and of Burma, as well as in the Bengal Bay operations, and they had been together to the last, when Mikuma, standing by her crippled sister, perished in her defence. Her gallant action commanded the respect and admiration of men throughout the Navy. As Admiral Yamamoto received the increasingly dismal reports from Mikuma, he decided on a course of action. At 12:30, he detached Rondo's invasion force and Cruiser Division 8 to speed to the rescue of Captain Sakiyama's ill-fated ships. As a further precaution, he also turned his own main body to follow them southward. At this juncture, it was believed that the enemy fleet consisted of at least one carrier, 2 converted carriers, and several cruisers and destroyers. If the enemy continued in pursuit, the Kondo force might engage him during the night, or Yamamoto's entire force could meet the enemy in decisive battle the next morning. In the latter case, it would be necessary to first knock out the opposing air power. To achieve this, Yamamoto could mobilize a total of about 100 planes, counting those of light carriers Hosho and Zueho and the seaplanes of the battleships, cruisers, and tenders. To augment this limited air strength, it was considered desirable to lure the enemy within range of the 50 or so medium bombers based on Wake Island. These planes could reach to within a few miles of the position of Mikuma's sinking. On the basis of these considerations, Admiral Yamamoto issued the following order at 15 o'clock to all the ships of his command. Combined fleet units operating in this area will catch and destroy the enemy task force within attack range of air forces based on Wake Island. At 15:30, from position 33 degrees 24, N, 169 degrees 00, E, the main body, Yamamoto, striking force, Nagumo, and the second section of Battleship Division 3 will proceed on course 180 degrees at 8 knots. The guard force, Takasu, will support the northern force. The land-based air force, Tsukahara, will take every opportunity to attack the enemy. This grand scheme was actually followed until the next morning, the 7th of June, when, with no enemy in sight and his ships in need of fuel, Yamamoto called off his vain pursuit and retired toward the homeland. Mogami, in the meantime, had continued westward in her effort to lure the enemy. Through the untiring efforts of her crew, a speed of 20 knots was achieved by 15:15, despite the heavy bomb damage she had sustained and the loss of her bow. She was fortunate that no enemy planes had appeared since Mikuma's sinking, and she was able to creep out of the very jaws of death, the last Japanese warship to come clear of enemy attacks in the Midway battle. Kondo's force finally rendezvoused with crippled Mogami and provided escort to Truk. Further American attempts to hit the retreating Japanese fleet this day were made by 26 B-17S from Midway, but the foul weather thwarted these efforts and no contacts were made. Alert to the possibility of attack by planes based on Wake Island, the enemy carriers also gave up the chase, and the action was over. Thus fell the curtain on a spectacular and historic battle. Japan's sole consolation for the defeat lay in the minuscule success of having captured 2 Aleutian bases. The northern operations, resumed after their earlier cancellation, had progressed smoothly and led to the occupation of the islands of Attu and Kiska on the 7th of June. But these unimportant acquisitions were small compensation for the devastating fleet losses suffered to the south, and in the end they were to bog us down still deeper in the quicksands of defeat. The catastrophe of Midway definitely marked the turning of the tide in the Pacific War, and thenceforward that tide bore Japan inexorably on toward final capitulation. Such, then, is the Japanese story of the Battle of Midway, its place in the evolution of Japan's Pacific War strategy, how it was conceived and planned, and how it was actually fought. In conclusion, the authors wish to attempt a summation of the principal causes of the Japanese defeat, adding some reflections on aspects not already dwelt upon in detail in the preceding chapters. The distinguished American naval historian, Professor Samuel E. Morrison, characterizes the victory of United States forces at Midway as a victory of intelligence. In this judgment the authors fully concur, for it is beyond the slightest possibility of doubt that the advanced discovery of the Japanese plan to attack was the foremost single and immediate cause of Japan's defeat. Viewed from the Japanese side, this success of the enemy's intelligence translates itself into a failure on our own part, a failure to take adequate precautions for guarding the secrecy of our plans. Had the secret of our intent to invade Midway been concealed with the same thoroughness as the plan to attack Pearl Harbor, the outcome of this battle might well have been different. But it was a victory of American intelligence in a much broader sense than just this. Equally as important as the positive achievements of the enemy's intelligence on this occasion was the negatively bad and ineffective functioning of Japanese intelligence. This was eloquently illustrated by the Naval General Staff's persistent misestimate, maintained until the very eve of battle and communicated to the advancing Japanese forces, that an American task force was operating in the Solomons area, strongly implying that the enemy had no suspicion of the impending Japanese attack on Midway. Nor was Combined Fleet's intelligence a great deal better. For despite the unusual enemy activity noted in the Hawaii area around the 30th of May, the 1st of June, Combined Fleet did not consider it a serious enough sign of enemy counter-preparations to warrant warning the Nagumo force. Another fundamental cause of the Midway defeat was the faulty basic planning of the operation. The most striking and obvious error in this regard was the manner in which the various naval forces were disposed. Here the planners indulged in one of their favourite, and in this case fatal, gambits: dispersion. Instead of massing what could easily have been the most formidable single naval task force ever seen, Combined Fleet chose to scatter its forces, reducing them thereby to comparative feebleness. Strategically, the Aleutian arm of this dispersion was unimportant, since it aimed only at destroying U.S. installations, occupying for a short time and then abandoning these northern islands. Tactically, the objective of the northern forces was to effect a diversion to the main thrust at Midway, but to sacrifice the sure advantage of concentrated strength for the dubious advantage of a diversion that might not, and actually did not, work was unjustifiable beyond question. But the dispersion was not limited merely to the main split of forces between the Aleutians and Midway. There was a further dispersion of forces within each of these two sectors. In the north, Kakuta's carrier striking force was to operate on its own, 300 miles in advance of Takasu's screening force of battleships. The dispersion of the Midway forces was much more extreme. Nagumo's carriers northwest of Midway, Yamamoto's battleship main body 300 miles back, Kondo's invasion force main body to the south or southwest of Midway, and Kurita's close support group moving in with the invasion transports from the southwest. Lack of concentration is one of the basic tactical weaknesses of war on land, sea, or in the air. At Midway, it facilitated the enemy's destruction of the Nagumo force, with the other Japanese forces too far away to strike even a blow. And once Nagumo's carriers had been destroyed, the Japanese weakness caused by dispersion became almost total impotence. In contrast, consider the effective compactness of the American forces. Concentrated at the outset, they remained that way throughout the battle, thus achieving a maximum of strength, offensive as well as defensive. As just one concrete example of how a wiser disposition of forces might have led to a different outcome of the battle, think of the vastly increased strength that would have resulted if the main body and the Nagumo force had operated together, with Admiral Yamamoto's big battleships serving as screen for the carriers. The tremendous firepower of the battleships and their escorts would have warded off many attacking enemy planes, and doubtless would have drawn some of the attackers away from our ill-fated carriers. In addition, Admiral Yamamoto would have had a direct control over the prosecution of the battle, which he did not have as a result of being too far away. Properly used, the battleships could have had real purpose and effectiveness in the action. Another error in planning was the failure to keep the emphasis firmly fixed on the central goal of the operation, the destruction of the enemy fleet. The original concept behind the operation was to use the invasion of Midway as a means of luring out the enemy fleet for decisive battle. But this concept was violated the moment that Combined Fleet, in its tactical plan, strapped the carriers to a fixed schedule and to a supporting mission for the invasion of Midway. Thereby the carriers lost the flexibility of movement that was imperative for a successful fleet engagement. Perhaps Combined Fleet thought it was safe to do this because of its firm conviction that the enemy would not depart his base until after the island had been attacked. But it should certainly have provided for the contrary eventuality. Destruction of the enemy fleet should have been unequivocally fixed as the foremost aim of the operation, and all else subordinated to that goal. Upon this basis, it would have been wiser to delay the entire operation until such time as carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku could have been readied to add their strength to the striking force. Combined Fleet refused to do this out of undue emphasis on securing the best possible meteorological conditions for the Midway landing operations. Equally defective and inadequate were the plans for pre-invasion scouting and reconnaissance. The fact that the submarines were delayed 2 days in sortying from the homeland removed all possibility of their arriving on station in time to observe the enemy's approach to the battle area and give warning to our fleet. But even if they had conformed to the schedule, there is some question whether they could have succeeded in sighting the American forces because of the more or less static position to which each submarine had been assigned. Not only should it have been made absolute that the schedule be kept, but these submarines should have been ordered to sweep along the line of the Hawaiian Islands from the waters northeast of Midway. The Operation K plan for aerial reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor also, although vitally important to the success of the Midway attack, was narrowly and loosely worked out, allowing for no alternatives when the basic plan did not succeed. As a result of these grave defects in the basic plans, the commanders of our forces in the battle had 2 strikes against them from the start. But even so, had it not been for the blunders committed by them in the tactical conduct of the operations, the conclusion seems justified that the outcome would not have been so miserable as it was. Elsewhere, mention has been made of the saying that battles are a succession of errors on both sides, and that victory goes to the side that makes the fewer. There is no question about which side committed the greater number of mistakes in the Battle of Midway. Indeed, from a study of the operations of the American, as well as the Japanese forces, it is hard not to acknowledge that all the errors in this action were committed on our side. That Admiral Nagumo was guilty of most of these does not warrant the conclusion that he was less competent than the other force commanders. It was his misfortune, because the Nagumo force was the only Japanese force actually to come to grips with the enemy, to be placed in the position of having to make most of the decisions which influenced the outcome of the battle. The other commanders, even including Admiral Yamamoto, who supposedly was to direct the operations of all the Japanese forces, found themselves reduced to the position of helpless spectators. They could not commit errors if they were not called upon, as Nagumo was, to take critical decisions. Having said that much to soften the criticism that must be made of our force commander, let us proceed to the criticism itself. It now appears, with the benefit of hindsight, that Admiral Nagumo committed 3 serious blunders. The first of these was his failure to enforce adequate search dispositions on the morning of the Midway strike. Had he employed an earlier 2-phase search, the unsuspected enemy task force would probably have been discovered soon enough to permit Nagumo to strike the first blow instead of taking it. At the very least, as soon as it was learned that Chikuma's and Tone's float planes could not be launched promptly on schedule, Admiral Nagumo should immediately have ordered other planes out in their place to fill the gap in his search pattern. Of course, the failure of Chikuma's No. 5 plane to spot the enemy carriers, despite presumably flying right over them, cannot be blamed on Admiral Nagumo. Nagumo's second mistake had to do with the method he employed in dividing up his carrier planes between the first and second attack waves. Each attack wave was made up of proportionate numbers of planes from all 4 carriers, instead of having just 2 carriers supply the first attack wave and the other 2 carriers supply the second. Though the use of planes from 4 carriers simultaneously meant less time consumed in launching and recovery, it necessarily increased vulnerability to enemy attack during and immediately after recovery operations, because all carriers were then engaged and unable to get their planes swiftly in the air to fend off an attack. It also meant that during such periods, the striking force was incapable of launching an attack on the enemy carriers, however urgently this might be required. Had Nagumo launched his Midway strike from just 2 carriers and held the other 2 in reserve, ready for any eventuality, he would not have found his hands tied at the critical moment of the battle. The third and perhaps gravest error committed by Nagumo was his failure, as soon as it was discovered that the enemy task force included a carrier, to launch immediately all available planes for an attack, whether properly armed or not, and even if fighter protection could not be provided. The risks were admittedly grave, but were they not far less grave than the risk of being caught by the enemy's carrier planes with all his own planes on board, and with refueling and rearming operations in full swing? Had Nagumo the right to count upon the enemy's not attacking him at just this moment of his greatest vulnerability? What becomes of his refusal to take the risk of sending his unprotected and improperly armed bombers against the enemy, when the course he elected resulted in their destruction, without even having been able to strike a blow in compensation for their loss? Yamaguchi's judgment in this crucial situation was the only correct one. Nagumo chose what seemed to him the orthodox and safer course, and from that moment his carriers were doomed. Nagumo's errors of judgment brought about the emasculation of his striking force before Admiral Yamamoto could do anything about it. In other words, the defeat of the Japanese forces was all but complete before Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet could bring his judgment to bear one way or another. But confronted by this grave situation, did Admiral Yamamoto take the wisest course that was open to him? Was he, too, not guilty of the same vacillation and indecisiveness that characterized Nagumo's action? The plan conceived by his staff and approved by himself for an attempt to turn the tide of battle by engaging the enemy in night surface battle was all too plainly a plan of desperation, with the odds all against it from the start. And when finally forced to the realization that the plan had no chance of success, Admiral Yamamoto promptly gave up the battle as lost beyond repair. The question is, was there really nothing that could have been done? Was defeat irreparable? Nagumo's carriers were gone, it is true, but Admiral Yamamoto had reason to believe that 2 out of 3 enemy carriers had been disabled by Hiryu's planes. This meant that the enemy would have had but 1 carrier left intact, with no others available to throw into the battle, whereas Yamamoto had 2 undamaged carriers left in Kakuta's 2nd carrier striking force to the north, and 2 more, Zuiho and Hosho, left in his own and Kondo's force. Instead of ordering resumption of the once-suspended Aleutians operation, then, why did Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet not leave in force his orders to Kakuta to come down and join the Midway forces, and, when Kakuta had arrived, add Zuiho and Hosho to the latter's 2 carriers to form a new and not inconsiderable carrier striking force? Admiral Yamamoto's failure to do this is the more difficult to understand in the light of his plan, formulated 2 days later, to engage the pursuing enemy task force in decisive battle with only the planes of Zuiho and Hosho, plus the float planes of his battleships and cruisers to provide air support, except for the dubious indirect support of shore-based planes from Wake. The reasons for Admiral Yamamoto's decision against this course, if he considered it, are difficult to guess. He was not the type of commander to shirk or seek to minimize his responsibility for failure. If he had been, one might suspect that he was seeking in the Aleutians a success to soften the blow of his defeat at Midway. There was also a serious fault in the command arrangements set up for the Midway operation, and this was a product of the Japanese Navy's tradition that in warfare a commander's place is at the front. Accordingly, Admiral Yamamoto kept his flag in Yamato and put to sea to serve as inspiration for the actual fighting forces. It is clear that this outworn notion has no place in modern naval warfare. It is far more important than any morale factor involved that the commander be informed of what is going on and be able to inform and keep control over all the forces for which he is responsible. Evidence that the United States recognized and acknowledged this situation is seen in the fact that Admiral Nimitz's headquarters was maintained ashore throughout the war, first at Pearl Harbor and later at Guam. Afloat in Yamato, as he was, Admiral Yamamoto was unable to communicate with the other units of his fleet because of the radio silence imposed until the last moment on all ships taking part in this operation. He was, therefore, unable to communicate to Nagumo the latest information received from Tokyo, and he was unable to exercise any control over the conduct of the operation until it was too late. If Combined Fleet Headquarters had been ashore, preferably at Tokyo, which was the intelligence and communications center, there would have been no limitation on his use of radio, and Yamamoto could not only have kept his forces informed of late developments and information, but he could have maintained close control throughout the operation. Much has been said here and elsewhere about the anachronistic views of the old-school Navy men and their notion of battleship supremacy. It was appalling to air-minded men to see the tremendous effort and expense put into the construction of super battleships Yamato, Musashi, and Shinano. True, Shinano was wisely altered to a carrier while under construction, but then suffered the indignity of being sunk by an enemy submarine SW of Tokyo Bay on the 28th of November 1944, just 17 days after her launching and within 24 hours after weighing anchor for her first service cruise, perhaps the shortest-lived warship of all time.